Hello, 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 and welcome to a tutorial about subjecthood and citizenship laws in Victoria 3's 1.10 update. With the release of National Awakening in 1.10, there came some big changes to POP acceptance, as well as the addition of a new citizenship law and changes to the effects of the existing ones. I don't normally dedicate an entire video to just one set of laws, but I found the addition of the new subjecthood law now begs the question, is this law good, and when should you use it? So in this video, we're going to break down what this new law does, what the changes are to the previous citizenship laws, and then we're going to look at a couple of examples as to when you want to use subjecthood and when you want some of the other ones. Let's dive in. As I said, 1.10 brought the addition of this new law, subjecthood, and now many countries start with it, including the country we're using as our example, Austria. To begin examining what subjecthood is, the explanation of it is actually very telling. The state defines its people foremostly as subjects of a sovereign, making little effort to encourage any official nationality. Cultures are largely left to their own devices within their own communities. What this tells us is that this law combats the creation of a national identity, meaning it stifles cultural fervor. We see right at the top you get an addition of plus 100 authority, so not so bad. The next two are negative 50% to support separatism strength and support separatism resistance. To talk about support separatism, we're going to switch to Sardinia-Piedmont, who has now researched nationalism. Their primary culture is North Italian. Looking at the list of political movements in Austria, you see they have a North Italian national movement with 3% marginal support and 15% passive activism. Looking at Austria's census data, we see that there are 4.84 million North Italians living in Austria. Unlocking the tech nationalism gives you this new diplomatic action called Start Supporting Separatism. By doing this, we will increase pop attraction and activism in the cultural minority movement associated with our primary culture, which is North Italian. So let's select this action and see the effect it has. Looking at the tooltip for activism on the North Italian national movement in Austria, you see our support separatism action has added plus 15.15% to the activism of this movement. Let's unpause the game and let it take effect. Now the movement's activism is drifting towards 31% because of the action we took. Remember, this movement can cause obstinance, so if the activism reaches 50%, states in Austria with North Italian pops present will be in a state of obstinance. I went into detail in my last video on cultural fervor about what this can do, but in a nutshell, it can cause a significant loss of tax revenue in the states that have North Italians present, as well as a decrease in the effects of institutions, conscription, and assimilation. So this is an action that can cause some serious problems for a country. Going back to our main example in Austria, having subjecthood will decrease the strength you have when inflicting this action on other countries, as well as decrease your own resistance to it from other countries. So in short, these two lines are a disadvantage this law gives you. You see, it also decreases assimilation by 25%, plus 100 acceptance for the primary culture. So far, other than the plus 100 points of authority, it's all been negative stuff. So what's the benefit of this law? The first thing we'll look at is at the bottom, plus 30 acceptance from being in your homeland. Remember, we have a number of cultural minority movements in our country. Currently, we have a Czech national movement, North Italian national movement, and a Polish national movement. What adds to a movement's activism is how many radicals they have and what acceptance level the supporting pops are. The lower your pop's acceptance, the more radicalized the pops will become. So in order to avoid this national movement getting to 50% activism and becoming obstinate, you want the supporting pops to be as accepted as possible. You can see from the North Italian heat map, all of our North Italian pops live in these 5 states. With the exception of Dalmatian, the rest are all North Italian homelands. Looking at the North Italian population in Austria, the vast majority of North Italian pops are in level 4 status. Looking at the breakdown of that, the biggest increase they're getting is the plus 40 for living in a homeland. They're getting plus 30 from subjecthood, and something new, an additional 10 from our law of no colonial affairs, which now gives Pops an extra plus 10 acceptance for living in their homeland. Subjecthood is the only citizenship law that gives acceptance for living in your homeland. Without this law, North Italian Pops and others will lose 30 points of acceptance. So the subjecthood law is helping to appease these cultural minority movements. I'll break down the rest of these numbers in a moment, but the thing to know about subjecthood is you are trying to appease your minority cultures. A little further along in this run, and we see the Polish national movement is at 74% activism, and 7 states are in a state of abstinence. Bringing up the tooltip, we see the breakdown as to why. Any state that has Polish Pops will be in some degree of abstinence. The more Polish Pops that live there, the more abstinence they are in. Looking at the state of West Galician, they have 7.8% abstinence, and so they are losing 19.6% of tax collection. We see here that results in a loss of £1,570. So we are losing that much from our weekly budget because the Polish national movement is in a state of abstinence. That is why it is a big benefit to get this additional acceptance for living in your homeland. 1.10 also brought a change to how cultural traits work. Previously, cultures simply had a cultural trait and a cultural heritage trait. Now there's a couple more layers to it. So at the start, you see a culture now has a heritage trait and a language trait. But now cultures are separated into trait groups. So the South German culture has the heritage trait of Germanic, but Germanic is part of the trait group European. The tooltip is showing you all the other cultures that share the heritage trait of Germanic. But now these cultures can share something in common with many other heritage traits that are part of the European trait group. You can see this big block of text. These are all the cultures that will share a heritage trait group with the Germanic culture. In the next chapter, when we look at the breakdown of all the citizenship laws, the amount of acceptance a law gives for sharing a heritage trait group will apply to all of these cultures in Austria. The same goes for the language trait. The South German culture has the language trait of Germanophone. Bring up the tooltip, we see the other cultures that will have the language trait Germanophone as well. But similar to the heritage trait, the language trait has a group as well. Germanophone is part of the trait group Germanic. Bringing up the tooltip, we see all the cultures that are part of the language trait group of Germanic. So when we look at the breakdown of citizenship laws, the amount of acceptance a law gives for sharing a language trait group will apply to all of these cultures in Austria. The last thing to look at are traditions. Not every culture will have a tradition. So we'll look at the Eastern German culture. Eastern German has the trait group Russosphere. Each citizenship law will give an amount of acceptance for sharing a tradition. You can see the cultures that share this tradition. You can see when we scroll the tooltip for all the cultures, these are all cultures that don't share a heritage or language trait. Their traits might share trait groups, but these cultures don't share any direct heritage or language traits. So traditions is a way for cultures who historically have some type of connection to have an extra level of acceptance because of that historical connection. So understanding the new way heritage and language traits are organized will help us understand the benefits and drawbacks of the various citizenship laws. Going back to subjecthood, we see the breakdown here. If you share a heritage trait or a language trait, you get plus 20 points of acceptance for each. If you don't share the actual trait but share a trait group for either heritage or language, you get plus 15 points. And lastly, if you share a tradition trait, you get plus 25 points. Now let's look at how this compares to the other laws. Ethnostate is exactly what you would imagine it to be. If you want to promote your primary culture and significantly raise your cultural fervor, this is the law you want. To start, you get plus 200 authority, so nice. You get plus 50% support separatism strength, but negative 50% support separatism resistance. So you get a boost to making the pops of your primary culture in other countries become more agitated. However, it makes you more vulnerable at home to separatists from your minority cultures. The big one for this law is the plus 20 cultural fervor from laws. You see here right now, our primary culture has fairly low fervor. The biggest things that will give your fervor a boost are literacy and the number of academics. If you go to war and a lot of your primary culture dies, you'll get a good amount of fervor for that as well. But you can see if we move to ethnostate, we would get plus 20 cultural fervor. That would almost double the amount of fervor we have. So ethnostate gives you a big boost if you're going for high cultural fervor in your primary culture. You can see you now get plus 100 points of acceptance for your primary culture. You get plus 20 points from sharing a heritage trait and plus 10 for sharing a trait group. But interestingly, you get negative 10 points for not sharing any language traits. So instead of getting no points, you now lose acceptance because of that. Language traits will give you plus 15 points and plus 5 for sharing a language trait group, and plus 10 points for sharing a tradition trait. So we see with ethnostate, the biggest boosts are if you share heritage. Moving on to national supremacy. National supremacy is kind of diet ethnostate. You get plus 150 points of authority, so a good amount, but a little less than ethnostate. You get plus 25% support separatism strength, but negative 25% support separatism resistance. Again, you are getting a boost to making your primary culture pops agitated in other countries, but making your country a little more vulnerable to the same being done to the minority cultures in your country. A good amount for both, but half of what ethnostate gives you. Plus 15 primary culture fervor from laws. So you get additional fervor, but playing on the same theme, it's a good amount, but less than what ethnostate gives you. Plus 100 points for your primary culture. Now, unlike ethnostate, national supremacy gives a little bit more acceptance to cultures that aren't your primary one, but share traits. You get plus 40 for sharing a heritage trait and plus 20 for the trait group. This is more than ethnostate gives you, but similarly to ethnostate, you lose 10 points of acceptance for not sharing any heritage traits. Plus 30 points for sharing a language trait and plus 15 for the trait group, but unlike ethnostate, you now lose 5 points of acceptance for not sharing any language traits, and plus 15 for a tradition trait. So national supremacy is a law that is aimed at boosting your primary culture similarly to ethnostate, but unlike ethnostate, it gives a little more acceptance to cultures that resemble your primary one. With racial segregation, we start to see the theme emerge even more. We are giving even more acceptance to cultures that resemble our primary one, but bigger penalties to ones that don't resemble us at all. So plus 100 authority, better than nothing, plus 10 primary culture fervor from laws. So you get a little bit of a boost, but nothing that's going to raise the stakes. Plus 100 acceptance for primary culture, of course. But now you see we get plus 60 points of acceptance for sharing a heritage trait and plus 50 for sharing the trait group. You can see now just by sharing the heritage trait, a culture will start in level 4 second-class citizen status. So now acceptance is not about being part of the primary culture, but just being a culture that resembles our primary one. And a culture that is simply part of the trait group will start in level 3 open prejudice. This status might seem bad, but remember, you still have to add in your religious acceptance. So any level of shared religion will probably boost that culture to level 4 second-class citizen. Remember, these are all the cultures that share a heritage trait group with the South German culture. So if we had racial segregation, all of these cultures will start in the level 3 acceptance status. Add in any bit of shared religion, and most of these cultures will probably be in level 4 acceptance in Austria. However, now we're starting to get a major penalty for not sharing any heritage traits. Negative 20 points of acceptance for not sharing anything. Same goes for language, plus 30 points for sharing the language trait and plus 15 for the trait group. But same as national supremacy, you lose 5 points for not sharing any language traits. And lastly, plus 20 points for shared traditions. Looking at cultural exclusion, we start to see how the laws correlate. Subjecthood is in its own category. These 3 laws are all pretty much working towards the same theme with lessening degrees. And now, interestingly, these 2 laws are more closely related to each other. Plus 50 authority, sure. Minus 25% support separatism strength and plus 25% support separatism resistance. So the opposite of what the previous 3 laws gave us. With cultural exclusion, you get a hit on your ability to cause agitation in other countries, but you get a boost to protecting your own country from outside agitation. You get plus 5 primary culture fervor from laws. I find this amount basically like the participation trophy of fervor boost. plus 100 points for your primary culture, plus 60 for sharing a heritage trait, and plus 50 for the trait group. But interestingly, we now get plus 10 points of acceptance for not sharing any heritage traits. This is the main thing that separates this law from the previous three. Instead of penalizing a culture for not resembling our primary one at all, we give it a boost. Same goes for language, plus 50 for sharing the language trait and plus 25 for the trait group. But now plus 10 points of acceptance for not sharing any language traits. And then lastly, plus 25 points for the tradition trait. The last one here, multiculturalism, is an interesting one. At this point, you've probably heard people say multiculturalism got nerfed in the 1.10 update. Let's look at what they mean. Before 1.10, this is what multiculturalism looked like. Plus 75 acceptance from culture. That means everyone, no matter what their culture is, gets 75 points of acceptance. That means everyone starts out in level 4 second-class citizen. Even with religious decreases, your pops will start in a very high level of acceptance. Couple it with total separation and everyone is fully accepted. So this is what it used to be, and this is what it is now. So same as cultural exclusion, you get a penalty to support separatism strength, but a boost to support separatism resistance, but the values are doubled from cultural exclusion. You get negative 10 points of primary culture fervor. So unique to this law is actually a hit to fervor. Minus 25% assimilation. Makes sense if all cultures are supposedly supported in your country now. Plus 100 acceptance for the primary culture. Makes sense. Same as cultural exclusion, you get plus 60 for the heritage trait and plus 50 for the trait group, but you get plus 20 for no shared heritage traits. So double what you get for cultural exclusion. Same as cultural exclusion when it comes to language, you get plus 50 for the language trait, but a slight boost for sharing the language trait group, getting plus 30. And once again, double the acceptance for sharing no language traits, giving plus 20. And lastly, plus 10 for traditions. But the reason why people say multiculturalism got nerfed is because before you saw every culture, no matter what, gets at least 75 points of acceptance. If a culture doesn't resemble yours at all, it gets 75 points. Now, if a culture doesn't resemble yours at all, it'll get the plus 20 points for no shared heritage traits and plus 20 points for no shared language traits. So a completely foreign culture only starts out with plus 40 points of acceptance. That puts them at the very bottom of level 3 open prejudice. If you add in any penalty for religion, they're now in level 2 cultural eraser. Now, multiculturalism is not a guaranteed open society, which results in a massive amount of mass migrations. Couple in total separation, and you still get plus 15 points of acceptance, so the most a completely foreign culture can get is the plus 40 from culture, and plus 15 from religion, resulting in 55 points of acceptance. Meaning the highest you can get a foreign culture in your country is level 3 open prejudice. Of course, there are events that happen that can add or subtract from this, but from laws, the highest you can get a culture now is level 3, where it used to be level 5. So as they say, multiculturalism has certainly been nerfed. Cultural acceptance is now a very layered and difficult task in this game. This is pretty much what the 1.10 update is all about. How do you manage cultures? When it comes to the question of what good is the subjecthood law, the first thing I think of is the country of Transvaal. A while back, I did a stream series called Transvaal's Revenge. One of the biggest problems I had in that run is that your primary culture is Boer, but as you can see, the Boers are such a small part of the country. They're the smallest cultural group, and the rest of the cultures don't resemble them at all. It made for a difficult run because the vast majority of your country is in a very low level of acceptance. You can see the vast majority of your country is in the level 1 violent hostility status. 558,000 people in a country with a total population of 616,000. You can see the state of Transvaal is a homeland to many cultures. The biggest group in your country is Sotho. Sotho shares nothing in common with the Boers, so the vast majority of your biggest cultural group is in level 1 status. If we enacted subjecthood in Transvaal, the Sotho culture will get plus 30 points of acceptance for living in a homeland, and an additional 10 for having no colonial affairs. The vast majority of them are losing 25 points of acceptance because of state religion, but if we got off that law and moved to freedom of conscience, they wouldn't lose anything and would have a total of 40 acceptance points. If we moved to total separation, they would get an additional 15 points, bringing them to 55 points of acceptance. 40 or 55 points puts them in level 3 open prejudice. If we can convert the pops to the state religion, then they would get even higher. But you can see, if we get off of state religion and simply move to freedom of conscience, the subjecthood law alone will give them 40 points of acceptance, putting them in level 3 right here. Add on to that the Promote National Values Decree now allows for pops to assimilate in their homeland. Subjecthood will slow down assimilation by 25%. However, it does allow for assimilation of pops in statuses 2 through 5. So we can keep our pops in a good level of acceptance, level 3, and on top of that, assimilate them at the same time. The last thing to note is when it comes to these increases in cultural fervor that you get from citizenship laws, these aren't absolute numbers. For example, just because you pass ethnostate doesn't mean the South German culture now gets plus 20 cultural fervor. A culture's fervor is its fervor worldwide. It's not specific to your country. So first, in order to get the fervor increase from your citizenship law, you need to be an independent country. Then you will get a percentage of that fervor increase based on how many of your primary culture pops live in your country. I go into much more detail on this in my cultural fervor tutorial video. But the short of it is, if you look down here at your population numbers, there are 14.4 million South Germans worldwide. In Austria, there are 5.49 million. So 38% of the South German population in the world lives in Austria. So if we pass ethnostate, we will get 38% of this plus 20 primary culture fervor from laws. So the South German culture will only get 9.5 points, not 20. So subjecthood is a very useful law in certain circumstances. Circumstances like Transvaal specifically. It can also help you pacify your minority rights movements so you don't enter a state of obstinance with their associated movements. However, the changes to all the laws also create a new dynamic of pros and cons. Now you really need to figure out which direction you want to take your country. A route of nationalism, a route of acceptance, but, not real acceptance, or a route of pacification. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please consider giving it a like and the channel a subscribe. Every time you do, another person from your primary culture says in your ethnostate country, "I don't have a racist bone in my body." That's it for now. As always, be awesome.